Dr. Zayas is a professor and Sutherland Chair in Mental Health and Social Policy at Steve Hicks School of Social Work. He is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral services at Dell Medical School at the University of Austin, Texas, the University of Texas. So he will talk today about migration, detention, separation, traumas of Central American children and families seeking asylum. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Zayas, for joining us. I've been looking forward to this presentation and having you. And I would like to say before that he has released a book. He did write a book. It should be published soon. So we will share the link to your book so that so people could order the book online.
Okay. First of all, I wanted to unmute myself and make sure I unmuted. And pardon the darkness. This is not my office. I'm coming to you from Brownsville, Texas, where I'm here at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. So at the opposite end of where you are. And now I will try to share the screen that I have to tell you something about my work. Okay, so here it goes. And this is always an issue trying to put this in observation mode. Okay.
Let's see.
Zayas, yep, there you go.
There it is.
Perfect.
Thank you. I just learned something new. Appreciate it. Okay. Well, anyways, I'm Luis Zayas. Very happy to be here and thankful to Nina Martinez for reaching out to invite me to be with you today and to tell you something about my work. But more importantly, not just my work, but the situation that's facing Central American children and families who come to the United States seeking asylum and ultimately will arrive and appear in your communities, excuse me, your communities and your agencies and your service agencies in time. Let me just say that the work that I'm about to talk to you about has been supported by National Institute of Health grants. I have no other disclosures with respect to financial support. I do want to make sure that you all know that I'll be presenting some pretty graphic photos and videos to get across the point about what it is to be an immigrant and to be detained as a child and even separated. So some of this might be disturbing. So I just fair warning that it is included here. So what I want to talk about, is there any ways I'm getting some, let's see, okay, stuff is blocking my screen from whatever the PowerPoint here. Let's see. Okay, so I want to talk about asylum-seeking families and children from Central and South America who are entering the United States and talk about the stages of migration that are important to know, because at each of those levels, there are experiences that children and families have that are important for us as providers of clinical services, whether we're talking about medical services or mental health, behavioral health services, or educational services, or any other service about what happens to families and how they get here. Talk a little bit about it, immigration enforcement, what happens with detention, deportation, separation when that occurs. It occurred more in 2018, and then what happens with release and the development, and look at the developmental and mental health aspects, impact on kids. And this is the book that was just mentioned. Actually, just as a footnote, today is the release date, February 21st. So I guess the timing was right for me to do this and to tell you about that the book is finally out as of today. I'll talk about human migration, human development, the neurobiology of stress and trauma very briefly, but mostly focus on how detention and separation impacts children's attachment and mental health. After many years of meeting with families, many years since 2014, when families were first put into detention from Central America, I began to discern that this is what, pretty much the trajectory of families. They're in the pre-migration period. They are, of course, in their homelands with their families, and increasingly there's distress that causes them ultimately to decide to leave. But that stress comes from issues of police ineffectiveness, government instability, violence, gang violence and extortion and kidnapping and ransoms and things like that, as well as interpersonal domestic violence, interpersonal violence that drive people to leave. One of the more recent conditions that's appearing increasingly so is the impact of climate change on their livelihoods, causing already fairly impoverished people to become even more impoverished. And that's at that point in the model here, you see on pre-migration, there's this a breach between between that and the mid-migration, which is at the point that a family decides to leave. And you see the little trigger event explosion there. That's intended to show that something has happened in the family's life. It could be any number of things, including the attempted recruitment of a child, of a son, typically, to the gangs, and a family decides it's time to leave. And they make that decision. It could take several months, several days, sometimes several hours to say, let's get out of here. And over the course of meeting hundreds of such families, any of these scenarios is possible. When they make that decision, they begin their migration. And that's the section here, the middle section called the mid-migration period, which is in the model just a piece, but it could range from weeks to months of traveling. In some cases now, we're talking about perhaps a year or more, where they travel from Honduras and El Salvador through Guatemala and into Mexico, and traverse their way all the way through Mexico, having, in the case of others, to travel. We're talking about Salvadoran families, Hondurans, and Guatemalan families, and so they will make that. And so that mid-migration journey, a lot of things happen during that time. They reach the border, and that's the point where they do the crossing. It could be any number of crossing. It could be a simple pedestrian bridge that gets them to the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or it could be in between, where they're then caught by the Customs and Border Protection. I am literally sitting less than 150 yards from the border as we speak, and the river is right there. And I'm told by the folks here in Brownsville how often they come across and even enter onto the campus, because the campus backs up into the international border. Upon being detained, they're put into detention. I'll talk more about all of that. And a lot of things could happen, critical incidents like in 2018, the separation of children, situations like others where I've had one father who suicided in a cell while his 4-year-old son was in there with him. And so those are some of the things that happen. Ultimately, there comes the release. And now with the surge and the overwhelmed immigration courts and asylum officers, there's a long time before they get a court hearing, which is way there at the far right of the little courthouse. So that court hearing could take for a long time. That's the post-detention period, which involves settling into American life and adjusting to life in a new country, even if it is somewhat suspended because they don't know how long they'll be able to stay. Again, pre-migration conditions and the decision to leave. Again, here are those powerful images that I've been told you about before, where this is daily occurrence. These are pictures that appear in the press, but it's something that may appear in press for us, but is very prevalent in the lives of many of the Central Americans, those from the Northern Triangle countries who come to the United States, who will risk life and limb, their children's lives, their own lives, for safety and security. And because of that violence, families simply can't stick around. That's part of what they start with. Here's the case of what was happening in Venezuela more recently, where you could see, while it wasn't the same sort of violence that we see in Central America from Venezuela, poverty and food scarcity are just awful. And that's a picture of a supermarket that was just simply depleted of all its merchandise. And on the right is a feeding center for those who just simply are too hungry. And this is a picture provided to me by a child to give you a sense of the impact on the children of this pre-migration violence. So a little boy named Danny, who was 7 years old at the time that I interviewed him, did a psychological assessment of him in Karnes Detention Center, which is in Karnes County, Texas. And it it fares pretty heavily in the first chapter of the book that we just talked about, where I talk about my first visits to Carnes, where I met kids like Danny. Also, this is detailed in a TED talk that I did in 2019. Danny lived in Honduras in a small town with his outside of the town on a farm with his mother and father and older brother. His uncle and his aunt lived nearby, and his grandparents lived nearby. And I asked him to tell me about what it was like, to draw me a picture of his town. And this is what he drew. And he called the gang members. This is a local name. I don't know, how accurate it is. You're hearing from a then 6-year-old, now telling the story as a 7-year-old, that the Revos Locos were the gang that marauded their neighborhood. And I asked Danny what made them, bad guys. Oh, because they smoke cigarettes and they carry guns. And you see in the picture there, they're smoking cigarettes, and they've got guns, and they're terrorizing people. Notice at the bottom right, the characters, the figure drawings that he's making. He made causing the death of someone who's in a box there, and just harming families. And like any child who draws a picture like this, he includes the son. And if nothing else, the son tells you that the emotional terror that he felt as a 6-year-old. Now he was, again, I want to restate that he's 7 years old at the time that I interviewed him, but it had been when he was 6 that this was happening. The trigger, remember when I talked to you about the ultimate trigger for families to leave occurs. And in Danny's case, it was the following. He was, this is up at the top are his abuelos, grandmother and grandfather. Over to the far left is his aunt and uncle's home. And to the bottom right is his family. And the Revos Locos are around town. And he tells me that one day he heard gunshots in his uncle's house. So he ran over there and found his uncle dead. Some man had broken into the house and it shot him. And Danny actually saw his uncle dead, bloody, his disfigured face, disfigured by the bullets, and on the ground. I mean, he puts him outside, but actually he was in the kitchen at the time of the killing. And he tells me how he remembered the one thing he stuck out for him was that he saw his uncle's teeth protruding from the back of his head. So that's not something that a 6-year-old makes up, right? It's something that they would have to have experienced. So he's drawing this day where his grandparents at the top, as you see, are horrified and weeping. His mom is just devastated. She's on the floor, on the ground, thrashing, and his father's there standing by. It is a maternal uncle that was killed. That was the trigger for this family to leave. And they could no longer stand it, because sooner or later they would come after the rest of the family, the Revos Locos would. And so the family set out one day shortly after this. And by the way, the Revos Locos at one point, these are teenage boys, had beaten Danny severely. It was 6.5-year-old boy, which is, just impossibly kind of cruel, right? And so they decided to leave. They tried once, but they couldn't get very far, because if you look carefully at the drawing down here at the bottom right, his father is a single leg amputee with crutches. And so they set out, but his father could not manage the journey. They came back, they spent a couple of days at home trying to fashion a new set of crutches and things. And they tried again, but he couldn't make it. But his father said to his wife, take the boys, save them, I'll stay back. At the point that I met Danny, and this was 2015 or so, he had not heard about his father. He didn't know if his father was dead or alive. And so I lost touch with him once we were able to get him and his mother and his brother out of detention and working with attorneys. But these two drawings are a child's depiction of what it's like. And a picture tells 1,000 words. And in children, we get what the interior emotional life is through their drawings. Once more, that sun, look at the sun, it's just terribly distressed at what's happened. And what we know is that when we witness the death of someone, when we see a dead body, not a body in a casket who's been taken care of by the mortician or the embalmer, whatever their term is, but when we see someone being killed or a dead body still mangled, perhaps from an accident or whatever, or even watching as it happens, a serious injury that might not lead to death, it is very stressful and even traumatic. And we do know from the research done that at Wally and others, and Ferry and others, and Hackett and others, that this event of seeing someone die and seeing a dead body that's really destroyed adds one of the largest parts, if you will, to PTSD. It's the one that's most impressioning, and long-standing. So it creates longer symptom duration than might be the case if they had not seen the death of the body and so on. It affects memory and helplessness, and the memories begin to form that become intrusive and often vivid recall. We know from that PTSD, the whole flashback, the fugue states of dissociation and things like that. And of course, the more trauma you see, the more distressing, the greater the level of impact it has on the formation and the duration of PTSD. Now they've left their country and they're now cutting across Guatemala, in the case of others, and into Mexico. And the voyage, the journey is fraught with questions about who do we trust, where is the danger, and what's going to happen. And they will see danger, depravity. They have to either hire coyotes to help them. They have to face criminals and organized gangs along the way. Back to this issue of trust. I heard from families, they didn't know who to trust on their way up. Who was in cahoots with the police or with the gangs? Was that old lady sitting on the church steps, was she trustworthy or not? I mean, you cannot trust anyone. And so that adds to the stress. Again, they're witnessing violence and death along the way, and they become victims. They're in prison sometimes by local gangs who want them to call back home and get more money for ransoming so that they can continue on their travel north. The deprivation, the intimidation, the physical abuse, the sexual assaults. I mean, it's quite something. I detail this in the book, so if you want to know more about it, I think it's important to see that how families, women in particular, and girls have to deal with the awful circumstances of the mid-migration journey. Again, the mid-migration, the risks and the challenges of hunger, animals, criminals, and so on. And the time frame for this mid-migration, as I mentioned earlier, is different for different families. Some people made it pretty quickly. Some took months to pull together money. They were stopped by La Migra, who took their money, and so they had to now earn more money to pay their coyote to keep on moving. So it really is not an easy process. Excuse me, that's the mid-migration journey. When they arrive at the border and they cross over, however they cross, they're apprehended, of course. And of course, they seek apprehension because they want to request asylum. And the Customs and Border Patrol, any law enforcement that finds them, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, must honor their request. And from there, they go to what are called hieleras and perreras, which informs the title of the book through ice boxes and kennels, which is, of course, a translation of hieleras and perreras. It is the first introduction to the American immigration enforcement system. And they're called family residential centers, but you and I know they're prison cells. Families are kept together. But let me just go back a moment. The hieleras are these cold rooms, and let me see, is there Yes, here's a picture of a hielera, or several pictures. And if you notice, this is what happens. They just arrived on the border. They're tired, they're hungry, they haven't bathed in days. They might be wet from crossing the river, the Rio Grande. Um, and this is the first stop that they're placed in. These are hieleras, which look like, kind of a gym locker rooms where everything is tile and cold. And it's intentionally kept cold. The lights are on all night. It's part of the immigration system's attempt to break them down and deter others from coming. What the lights are on all night, all day and night. It's cold in the 60 degree, sometimes colder. They're given these Kevlar, I think, whatever these are, blankets that we see more at the end of cold marathons in cold weather. But here they are kept in here for anywhere from 24 to 48 hours. I'm sorry, to 72 hours. So it's difficult, but look at also the indignity that our system imposes on them. At the back of each of these, you see in these two yellow water coolers, and one in the top, it's orange. On the other side of that wall is one toilet. And all 30 or so people who are in there must use that toilet. And that means you're going about your business, we would say, exposed to others. People are watching and seeing. And that adds also further indignity and harm to the families and the kids. At one meeting, I met with colleagues who had been talking to some of the kids in these detention centers, in these hieleras, and a group of girls were saying how they slept around the toilet because somehow the water warmed up the tiles there. So it gives you a sense of what desperation is, and people doing things that perhaps most of us wouldn't consider doing in a public bathroom. We know that when you hold people, children in detention, you're creating a level of trauma, and there are two elements to that trauma. And one of them is the deprivation that happens in detention. Children and their parents are deprived. Let's focus on children. The children are deprived of their typical developmentally expected routines, right? When they're in a detention center, after they've left the hielera and now they're in a prison cell as a family, the parents no longer have any authority over their children. They don't cook for them. They cannot cook for them. Everything is governed by the private prison company that runs the institution. And so children can't ride bikes. They don't go to the candy store in the neighborhood, all the things that we expect our children to be able to do, interact with teachers and, merchants, and, go to church on Sundays and attend Sunday school with you, or whatever the case might be. All of that is lost. So children who spend time in detention have that part of their developmental experience is simply deprived and truncated, and has devastating effects. The other trauma is the threat. The constant threat when you're in detention that you may be physically menaced by staff. They don't typically, they're not necessarily physically abusive, but there's that threat of abuse, of physical violence, and psychological violence is common. Guards saying, "Oh, you're never going to get out of here. Oh, as soon as we can, we're going to separate you from your mom." Whatever the case may be. "Oh, we're waiting till you turn 18 because then you go into adult immigration, and that's another story." So these things add to what the stress and the trauma that of being in detention. And so what are the results of that? We've seen sudden upsetting memories. Kids have nightmares, reminders and threats, night terrors, sense of humiliation. Children report numbness and dissociative episodes. Not only do they describe, but their parents describe to us, both in detention and after. They never get a sense of safety. They're not going to, well, not never, but without intervention, but they don't have a sense of safety even once they're in the prison, because you don't know what's going to happen. I call them prisons. They are called detention centers, but typically they're converted prisons. The parents' mental health, of course, is affected, and their functioning is diminished, and consequently, a child has to deal with that, with what's happening to mommy or daddy, and so on. And the parents' mental health is affected. The traumatic separation happened in 2018 during the family separation policy, and we saw all sorts of terrible effects on children. And I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes how that affected children, in particular, the distress and anxiety. Again, what happened when children were separated for months, and then once reunited, we could see reactive attachment disorders, which is DSM, a DSM disorder, classified disorder, where kids have trouble reattaching to their primary caregiver. I'm sorry, let me just go back a second. So not all children who spend time in detention are separated, but beyond being traumatized by detention, they were traumatized by the separation. And we know that human attachment is critical for growth and development, right? It is attachment between the primary caregiver, most often mom or a maternal surrogate, is the fundamental human bond, child and parent, right? That's universal and from the beginning of time. And we do know that a secure attachment between a parent and a child has lifelong implications for the child's mental health, their interpersonal relationships, their development. A securely attached child is confident, has positive interactions with parents and others after a separation. And that security has positive outcomes, their emotional development, behavioral, cognitive, social. And across cultures, the securely attached child is the modal child, the average child, normal kid, kind of in a normal distribution, the bell curve, that most kids in cultures are securely attached, despite the fact that parenting styles may differ by cultures, but still, regardless of the culture, the child who is secure is the most often seen in cultures. So here's this goes back to the work of John Bowlby on separation, attachment, human attachment, imprinting, and so on, and it introduced the importance of that, and Mary Ainsworth and others advanced the field to understand what attachment is, when you have secure attachment, and the types of insecure attachments that happen when a child is suddenly separated from their parent, and then are reunited. She had this research in which there was episodes of being together and being separated and reunited, and the presence of a stranger, and so on. One of the insecure attachment styles that she and others have substantiated through the research is what's called insecure avoidant attachment. So that when a child is separated for some period of time and then comes back to their parents, the child responds with an expectation that they're going to be rejected yet again by their parents. If that's, that may be some of the fear when they reunite. So the child avoids the parent and may kind of, stay away from them, or if held, might really pull away from the parent, rather than seeking proximity, which is most of you, or many of you, all of you know what children do when mom and dad get home from grocery shopping and grandma's been taking care of the kids, or they've had a babysitter. They run into their, oh, I'm so happy to see you. What do you got in the bags? And what did you bring me, cookies or whatever? That's, a securely attached child at the separation. But when we had in 2018 the family separation policy, which ripped children literally out of parents' arms, we were doing untold harm. And so later, when these kids were reunified with their parents, we had these indication of the different insecurely attached children. And so one of them, as I say, is insecure attachment, to display avoidant behavior, and they don't get close to their parents because they anticipate conflict or rejection. And so this here is a case of a little boy. This is on the internet. You can find it easily. I'm giving you just a clip of it, of a boy in 2018 who was reunited with his mother after being separated for 3 months by the Trump administration. And in this case, the father and the mother, I believe they were Honduran, father and the mother, this little boy and his baby sister all came to the border together. At that point, they were separated. They were taken into custody and separated. The mother and the baby girl were were taken somewhere else. Then the father and the son were taken this occurred in Texas. I think the mom remained someplace in Texas. The father was moved to Arizona. And from there, his son was separated from him and moved to someplace, I don't know, Michigan or far, far away for 3 months. So this boy lost his mom tragically, traumatically, then his father and his sibling, his little baby sister, of course, and separated for 3 months. He was held in foster care. Finally, they were reunited this day in July of 2018. As you'll see, this boy, he's about 3 years old or so, and he demonstrated the insecure avoidant attachment after this lengthy separation, where he didn't know where his mommy was, he didn't know where his daddy was. So to get to this point in this reunification, the boy was brought to his father in Arizona from wherever the boy was, reunited there. We don't have video evidence of what happened there, so we will have to guess that it was not pleasant for the boy. And then they're flown to Bush International in Houston, where the mom and the daughter were brought. So this is the first time that this little boy sees his mom. I'm going to play the video for you so you can see both his mom's pleas and his behavior. And I hope that the sound will carry to all of you. Let me know immediately and I can replay it. So, notice she's crying out, you know, I'm your mom. We've been separated. I'm your mother. And you see how he's pulling away. He is avoiding her like the Dickens. And it continues. He pulls away. She's asking her husband what happened. He's holding on to the baby, you know, that he hasn't seen in 3 months. The boy crawls over. When I first saw this, I thought, well, maybe he's going to go to his dad, but no, he goes right between his father's legs and continues on, sits behind. His mother pursues him. So you see in this video, and I again, this is one of those moments, it's hard to watch, and for those of you who are seeing it for the first time, it really is very difficult to watch. But you see that a rupture in the attachment, the way it was handled during the family separation policy, what the tragic results could be. This boy his family were featured about 6 months after this on 60 Minutes or one of those shows. I think it was 60 Minutes. And they were interviewed. And the mother was saying that, you know, he's still not the same boy. He's starting to come around, but he's not the same boy that we knew. While they videotaped him, he was more engaged, but still you could sense that there was a distance, this boy, between him and his mother and his father, that he just, even 6 months later, we don't know also if there was any intervention that had occurred between the time of the tape you just watched and the video that was shown in 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes. But I think we have to think about what are the interventions. We'll come back to that in a minute, because as providers and community leaders, you've got to think about this. So, that's one outcome of a child who presented that way, who's been separated. In the second video, I'm showing you a child who was also separated, except he had a different insecure attachment. His was called insecure ambivalent. And in that case, the child is not really sure that he can trust his parents. So he might come closer to them, but he's not really sure. Can I trust you? The child is uncertain if the parent's response, what the parent's response will be when they reunite after this separation. And they can display passive or angry, resistant behavior that really determines how close I'm going to get to you or not. And then when the parents responds, trying to get their child closer, the child may be ambivalent. And all it takes is the mom or the dad or that attachment figure to say, I got to put you down because I got to get the clothes out of the laundry or something, out of the dryer. They may see that as abandonment again. And so they're ambivalent. And so it may cause the appearance of the distress. So again, this is another approach. In this video, this is a boy and his mom in a shelter. They had been in detention, separated, brought together again, held in detention. I don't know how long apart they were. That was not in the data I have. But this is a boy who's about to go to bed, and he demonstrates this insecure ambivalent. Again, he's in a shelter with his mom. You see that he's uncertain of his mom's affection, and he becomes angry and resistant. One other point. Earlier in the video, he's seen interacting with his mother the way most kids would, laughing, hugging and doing. But something happens as nightfall comes. And we have to ask ourselves, so what happened to this child that bedtime is fraught with anxiety and where all of this insecurity begins to reemerge? What, we don't know. What did the mother do? Not that she intentionally did it, but that the child perceived a rejection or an abandonment just prior to this. But here is the boy and his mom at night. And this is where we begin to see the insecurity and the ambivalence. Here we go.
Toda esta separación fue muy larga, mi hija ya ha cambiado mucho. Con tanto trauma. Ya no quiero ser tu hijo, ya no soy tu hijo.
So you see yet another result. These are 2 of the thousands of children that have been separated at the border. And while there was an uproar, as you recall, in 2018, and the family separation policy was rescinded, it continued on for much longer than that into 2019. And even today, there are children who have still not been reunited with their families. Over 500 kids still have not been reunited, whether in the US or back in their homeland. So this is just one example or 2 examples of the kinds of kids and the experiences that will be appearing in your communities. So as providers, we need to say, how do we intervene with these children? This is just 2 cases, but kids like them, different age group. How do we, what parenting work do we need to do with the mom in both of these cases? Wonderfully, though, is that both of these moms are very sensitive to their child. So it makes your work as providers much easier, because you saw that last mother who was she was really kind and gentle. Who told you that? And she doesn't get upset. She doesn't yell at him and say, how could you say that? I'm your mom. And she really handles it well. So it really bodes well for intervention. Same thing with the first mom. I mean, she was just distraught that her son would not. What are the mental health services that the parents are going to need? The father in the first video, we don't know what's happening with him. He had suffered a gunshot wound. That's one of the reasons they had fled. And so that was part of the trauma. But, separation from his wife, from his daughter, what that has meant to him. What services would you identify for these families in your community? And how should your community organizations respond? How should your churches reach out to them to engage them, in places of safety and worship, where they can create community, where, a lot of commerce happens where, where's the best place to buy this, or what schools are best to enroll my children? All of that happens in communities, places like churches. So how do we as social service providers, help families prepare for this? So even today, we have detention. Folks are being kept in hieleras and perreras. There are very good people working in ICE and CBP who care deeply about the people who are crossing the border and understand the dangers that they have faced and the traumas, and they're kind. Not everyone is the same. One of the difficulties of having a detention center system that's operated by private prisons is that they come at it as prisoners. Imprisoners. That is, from a penal mentality of these are not families, these are prisoners. These are, these are not immigrants, these are criminals. So they have this mentality of a punitive guard mentality, rather than doing what we should be, which is serving as guardians of these families. So we do have that struggle, and I think it's important to know that this is what the kids have gone through, but also what we can do to serve them once they're in. The post-detention and beyond is something, like I say, where we're going to have to face these families. They are released into our communities. And there are two processes that happen. One is the kind of the assimilation part, which is settlement, getting housing, employment, getting the kids enrolled in school, good pediatricians, churches, and so on, as I mentioned. But then there's the psychological adjustment, which is far harder for many of the families. How do we help maintain their psychological well-being after these piling on of traumas and stresses and hardships and physical, deprivations that they have suffered, and the disruption in family rituals and family functions and parents' mental health? That's what we're going to be facing with many of these families, and we need to be there to provide them help. Another group of kids, and this is, I'm coming to the end and open it up for questions, are the unaccompanied children who enter the United States. And it's a new area for me. I'm less familiar with it. I have not worked as much, but I have engaged in trying to understand what their needs are. If you recall, we don't really know what happened to that little boy in the first video during the time that he was separated from his parents. But we do know, and as providers, we could get the parents to tell us what it was like, why they left Honduras, what it was like during the mid-migration process, what it was like in detention, and then the reunification. And so we have at least adult informants in both of those cases, the first two. But when it comes to unaccompanied minors, we don't have that. They're coming, especially young ones, they're coming these long stretches, but we don't have the adult information. And children, as we all know, that may not share with us what their experiences were, and they do it by drawing and by play and by the sorts of experiences they had. So in this video here, I want to show you what happens to two little Ecuadorian sisters, ages 3 and 5, who were dropped about a year and a half ago, 2 years actually, going on 2 years, dropped near Santa Teresa, New Mexico, west of El Paso. And this is in the middle of the night. The story, once it broke, was that these girls had been left with their grandparents in some mountainous regions of Ecuador, not Honduras or Guatemala or Mexico. So they had to traverse the coyotes that were hired by the parents brought them from Ecuador. I'm trying to think of my geography, but that would have meant, Ecuador, I guess Colombia, Panama, and perhaps depending on the route, Costa Rica, and then the other, all the way to the United States. Far, it's kind of more like several thousand miles rather than the 1,800 or so miles from the Chiapas, say, to the United States. And so these girls were brought by a coyote. And here's what it looked like the night that CBP caught them with night cameras being dropped. As you see here, the coyote is on the wall. He stretches down just to try to break a little girl's fall. That is the 3-year-old girl who is brought, and he's dropped. The height of this is about 14 feet, as I understand from reading. And now he brings over another child, a sister. Meanwhile, the little girl who has fallen is just staggering, getting up. The second child is dropped, and a package. The coyote drops the children and runs off. Let me stop there. I have 2 granddaughters, literally this way. Well, one is 3, one is 6. I cannot imagine, and I'm sure you can't either, what it must be like for your children to be in the hands of coyotes covering maybe 3,000 miles. You don't know, you've paid and you're hoping and you're trusting that they will actually bring your children to safety. Take care of your children. So when I look at these 2 little girls, I think of my granddaughters and how emotionally pained I would be. I don't know that I could live. But as I play this tape here, you'll see the 2 little girls interacting, and the camera watches the 2 coyotes running off still. But when it comes back, it doesn't show it. But the video continues, and the 2 little girls are talking. I can only imagine what they're saying. Because it seems like the little one, the first one that was dropped, who gets up and staggers, is going to the older one and saying, I don't know what she's saying, but you okay? Where are we, or something. Just imagine what it's like. That little bag that was tossed afterward, in there, there were the documents, the girls' documents, birth certificates, and a cell phone with only one number in it, their number to their parents in the United States. And so these coyotes did their job, and these children, as it turned out, were picked up. They were picked up by Customs and Border Protection. And these are literally the pictures of the girls. Of course, their face is not shown. And the female CBP officer who was there first with them. Excuse me. As clinicians, as providers, we have to ask, how do we assess these girls? We don't have a history of what happened to them during the migration. They were found to be healthy. Nothing had happened. There was no sexual abuse. But we still don't know what, hunger or deprivation they experienced along the way. So we don't know about their experiences. As clinicians, what do we then tell parents to watch for? Because, by the way, they were reunited with their parents here in the United States. And the government backed off, did not pursue any charges against the parents because it was more important to maintain the health of these 2 girls. But what do we tell the parents to watch out for in their behavior, this attachment issue, other issues of trauma? These children were not ripped from their parents' arm. The parents had come to the United States, try to get a foothold, an economic foothold, and bring them their children. What services would we provide for this family in your community? And what does your organization have to adapt to respond to families like this one and others? I don't have the answers. None of us do, but it's what we're going to face and what we're already facing in the United States with children who have come and sought asylum. We do know that there's a number of things that we need to be prepared for, the child-parent psychotherapy, really work with them, parent-child interaction therapy. How do we help build the bonds again between a parent and a child, help parents understand why their children are behaving the way they are? And of course, we have to think about the parents' own mental health, right? their own mental health therapy for them, as well as psychoeducation, so that they can understand the child's development, the self-awareness of what they can do to try to minimize the impact of all of these traumas on their children. Family therapy to build communication, cohesion, and the flexibility that families need. And of course, any psychological adjustment requires that settlement period too. How do we engage them in recreation, schools, youth groups, family groups, churches? Again, I come back to that as a means to help families reintegrate and assume normal lifestyles. Those are the topics and the questions I've had, and I'm ending here.
Dr. Zayas, respect your time. I just want to tell you how profoundly grateful that I am that you took my call when I made that call, and that you volunteered your time to join us for this important presentation. We have a lot of questions that I'll be following up with you on, but this is definitely heartbreaking. But I appreciate your work, and I appreciate you bringing this to our awareness, and we'll continue this conversation. So I want to thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Zayas.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and to your audience. I know this is not easy for a Tuesday afternoon, but I think it's important that we see it and understand it more deeply than just what we read in the papers or the biased reports we get in the news. So thank you very much.